right. Good morning and welcome to our first video lecture in our Anatomy and Physiology class. Now, these video lectures are going to follow along and really run through the same stuff that our lectures in class are going to run through. However, these, if you miss a class or if you prefer to slow down the video, maybe speed it up if I take a little bit more time in class, or you feel like subtitles helps a lot for language, then these lectures are going to be a fantastic way for you to still get the notes while not having to hear everything I say in class. And so this is going to be our first one of these video lectures. As we get into later units, you guys are going to have more options of being able to do lectures, textbook notes, or watching these video lectures. And so get a feel for today. This is going to be the only option for today. And so if this works, right, as we go forward into our next units, you'll have more of these and you'll be able to use more of the video lectures to use your notes rather than just in-class lectures. Now, today we are going to be talking about our second of our learning standards for our first unit, for our introduction unit. And this is going to really focus on this idea of homeostasis and what we need to survive. And I want to start this lecture by kind of running through a quick story. If you've had me for bio, you've definitely heard this before, but I always find this to be a really interesting kind of case study that then leads into the larger section of this unit. And I want to tell you guys about back when I was like 10, 12, the biggest thing was the Wii, right? Nintendo Wii, it came out and you could not buy one. It was impossible. I remember my mom would go to like store to store to store, and we just could not find a Wii. They were like selling like hotcakes, impossible to find. And so during this time, there was a radio show, I believe it was KDND, and they ran a contest called Hold Your Wii for a Wii, which is really stupid. And the general premise was people came to the show, they drank water for as long as they could, and whoever waited the longest to use the restroom won. General premise kind of makes sense. It's a little silly, but as this contest started going and as it went longer and longer, what started happening was the radio show started getting a lot of calls from doctors. And those doctors were saying, you need to stop doing this. This is going to be a problem. They, laughed it off, disregarded. And then around the end of the contest, there was one woman who bailed out. She was done. It was over. About an hour after she had left the contest, she had went to the bathroom, passed out, and had what is called a brain aneurysm. She had a brain bleed. And this is what the doctors had been calling about and had been kept repeating is going to be a problem. Because the issue and the way our bodies work is that we have these certain nutrients, things that we need to sustain life. Water, food, air, right? Those general ones. And our body balances those really, really specifically because I'm sure you've heard it, too much of anything can cause damage, can cause harm. And so our body has a really good system to regulate and limit the ability to do harm to ourselves, right? Your ability to use the restroom is a way to regulate how much water's in your body because, and what they found out through this, through this TV show was too much water can lead to bursting cells, specifically bursting blood cells and bursting vessels in the brain, causing brain aneurysms, brain bleeds, and death, right? This is why we need to regulate these things. This is how our body sets up these systems to make sure that we are always able to maintain life, to survive. And so this kind of general story leads us into our big idea today of homeostasis. And homeostasis is the way that our bodies, as well as any living thing's body, is able to sustain conditions that allow it to survive, right? In general, we have three major things that we need to physically survive. Those are food, water, and air. But then we also need some other aspects, like environmental aspects, things like body temperature, things like the amount of water in your body, things like the amount of blood, your pH levels. All of these things are being regulated within your body, and when they fall out of regulation, like we saw in that radio contest, things can go wrong, right? We call this a dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic, right? Think it's shifting, it's changing. Equilibrium, there is a line, a basis, right? For your body temperature. We want to be about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. You can go a little bit above, you can go a little bit below, but in general, we want to stay in that level. Because if we go too high or too low, it actually limits and prevents processes happening within your body to no longer be able to happen. And so this homeostasis idea, this maintaining of our stable conditions, is what really allows us to survive as organisms. And when we talk about anatomy and physiology, anatomy is really what is the thing made of, right? We talked about the mech. What are you built out of? What is it physically? While the physiology is the dynamic equilibrium, the maintaining of this homeostasis. Well, I have this system, but how do I make sure it works perfectly? And how do I maintain that for as long as possible? Now, for our homeostasis, there's a couple things that we need to regulate and are major things that we want to consider when we're thinking about what is actually being regulated by homeostasis. These are things that we call survival needs. Basically, what do you need to be alive? I think about this as our rules of three, right? You might have heard this at some point, maybe not, but in general, they say that you can survive for 3 weeks without food. I wouldn't recommend it, but technically your body can sustain itself for 3 weeks, and that's an average. Some people more, some people less. You can sustain yourself for 3 days without water, and you can sustain yourself for 3 minutes without air, right? And so oxygen, water, food are our major survival needs, the major things that we need to power the mech suit that is our body. And the physiology of us is how do we regulate those things to make sure that we are always working optimally, right? And so nutrients are what actually gives us energy. They are what sustain us. They come in the forms of carbs, proteins, fats. And again, we can survive about 3 weeks without food. However, this is how we're going to be able to get energy into our body. The digestive system and the circulatory system are going to be the two major systems that are involved with this process. We also have water, right? Water is the most abundant thing in our body. Most reactions within our body, so your digestive system actually requires water, as well as your circulatory system, the transport, right, the highways for your body require that water. That is the liquid, the medium in which nutrients, oxygen are able to get where they need to go. And so water is vital in making sure that we can transport things where they need to go. And in the Hold Your Wee for a Wee story, basically what happened there was we added more water, which in turn adds more traffic to that circulatory system. More traffic means more things back up, means more pressure on the sides, and inevitably more risk of burst because of the amount that's in there, right? And so water is something that we really, really need to regulate. And your urinary system is what allows us to regulate that, right? When you need to pee, it's because your body physically needs to get rid of that water. And if you don't pee for a while, it's probably because your body doesn't have enough water and you're actually telling your body to hold on to it, keep it, okay? And then our last one, or our last major molecule that we need is oxygen. And oxygen is really, really important because it's actually what fuels cellular energy. So the way that nutrients, food, power our energy, like the macro energy, oxygen is what really powers the micro energy. And without that oxygen, we can't do cellular respiration, and therefore we can't do anything that requires energy. And so respiratory system is what's going to allow us to bring that oxygen in, and then the circulatory system will transport that where it needs to go. And then the last one is this idea of normal body temperature / normal environmental conditions. Basically the idea that within your body there's a couple things that are being regulated, things like temperature, things like pH, And those things need to stay at a general level because enzymes, right, the proteins that do reactions within your body, work ideally at specific temperatures. If you remember back to our bio class, if you took honors bio with me, you'll remember that we did that catalase enzyme lab. And when you heated that catalase up, it actually stops working. This is why fever can end up leading to really, really bad problems, is sometimes it can fully denature enzymes, meaning that the reactions that need to happen within your body can't occur anymore. And we are really good at maintaining a normal body temperature, primarily through our integumentary system, our skin, as well as our excretory system, which allows us to release some things in sweat, and our muscular system, circulatory system, regulate blood flow that also will allow us to regulate temperature. This is why if you are like out in the cold, your hands might start getting like very pale and a little bit blue. The reasoning is that your body's actually siphoning blood back towards the core. Losing a finger isn't ideal, but it's much better than losing your heart. And so our bodies are really good at regulating temperature, changing where blood, changing where muscles are being stimulated to make sure that we can regulate temperature and regulate that temperature at the most vital spots. And so that's another condition that we need to keep in homeostasis. Now, those are the general things that are being regulated. But when we talk about life, we really need to know what are we talking about and what are the things that life needs to be able to do, right? We have those nutrients, the things that are being regulated, but let's now look at what do we actually classify as life and why are humans / other organisms that we're going to look at, we're going to dissect rats, why are these things considered life? What about them indicates life? And so the first criteria of life that we think of is this idea of maintaining boundaries. If you're going to be an organism, you need something, a line that distinguishes between you and other things. For single-celled organisms, it is your cell membrane, right? It's just the thing that goes around you, or your cell wall. For us, because we are so specialized, because we have so many cells, we have a system specifically set to make a boundary for us. And that is going to be our integumentary system. It's going to be the next system that we really look at and focus on because it is the first and it is the one that really regulates what is you and what is me. Our integumentary system is really good at regulating nutrients in and out in terms of keeping water in and making sure that the things that we interact with on our day-to-day basis aren't able to slip through our skin into our body, right? Our protection from disease bacteria is because of this boundary, and our skin is really good at creating that boundary. We also have movement. Any living thing needs to be able to move. It sounds weird because you might think of like trees, plants. Well, they don't really move in the way we do, but they instead move towards sunlight, and that is still movement. And so our ability to move, whether voluntary or involuntary, is an important facet of our life. And for this, it's going to be your muscular and skeletal system that are really going to play with one another to create movement, as well as your circulatory system that is going to basically be the pump that allows for the system to work. It's what's going to get all the nutrients, all the oxygen where it needs to go. And then we have what is called responsiveness. This is kind of in the idea of movement, but more about can you react to stimuli, right? When we look at plants, if you shine light on specific like sections of the plant, it will grow towards that specific section. So that is movement, but also responsiveness. It can change based on the environmental conditions it's within. We do this as well, right? If I, jump into a pool and it's freezing cold, well, my body is going to immediately respond to that and I'm gonna pop out. If I put my hand on a burning hot desk, well, my body's immediately gonna go, ouch, yank it off, and that is my responsiveness, my irritability. It's weird to think of responsiveness, irritability, but think if I'm irritated, right? If I'm annoyed at something and you say something to me, I'm going to say something back. I'm irritated. It's my ability to respond. And this is primarily going to be regulated by your nervous system, which is going to do most of your day-to-day things, right? Responding to a friend situation, responding to Mr. H asking me a question in class. That's your nervous system, while your endocrine system is going to respond to larger things. Things like, oh, I just turned 12 and now I'm releasing these hormones to initiate puberty to start developing into an adult. You're responding, but you're responding to biological cues, bigger things. Your body needing to, drink water. Let's say all of a sudden you're like, I'm really thirsty. Well, that's because your body is dropping and responding to stimuli within the system that allows it to create larger responses. And so all of this is happening within your body, mostly controlled by the nervous and endocrine system. We then have digestion. This is just your ability to take in larger nutrients and break them down, and then absorb them into bloodstream for us, but into the organism, to allow those nutrients to be used for cellular respiration to generate energy, right? And so digestion is essential. You need to be able to take in nutrients and use them for processes that create energy. For us, it's our digestive system and our circulatory system that are really going to be doing that primarily. We also have this thing called metabolism. All organisms need to have metabolism. And this is the idea of all of the breaking and making that happens within your body, right? So digestion is the breaking, the catabolic pathway. But for every breaking that you do, you take those raw materials that you broke apart and you use them for something else, right? If you said, how do I build muscle? Well, the answer is pretty easy. To build muscle, you eat a lot of protein and you work out. Why do those two things matter? Well, if I eat a lot of protein, I break down a lot of protein. That breaks down into amino acids, base, building blocks. And then, as I go and work out, I rip little holes in my muscles. What fills in those holes? Amino acids. Where do I get them from? Well, I just ate them. Take them, put them in, fill the gaps. We do that over and over and over again, and then you got huge muscles. That's metabolism, right? It is the breaking of the things you put in, and then the conversion of those building blocks into something bigger that is part of you as a result of your life environment, your outcome, right? If I work out, I rip holes, I need to use those building blocks to fill in the holes. And so metabolism is actually going to be multiple systems because it is both the breaking and making, right? It's going to be digestive, respiratory to get that oxygen, and then circulatory, move the nutrients around, endocrine to really regulate the big picture thing, right? Regulate in general, how much does this person need to be making? Your metabolism is going to be way, 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 way faster when you're younger because you need to make more things. Then when you're older, it kind of slows down. We also have excretion, right? If you are going to be taking in crazy amounts of nutrients, water to regulate all these processes, you also have to be able to remove them, right? Waste products build up. As we do these reactions, in the same way that in your house trash builds up, waste does too. And so if we don't have a method or a mechanism of removing that waste, then really we're stuck with kind of a trash pit, and it'll be that way until we die, right? And so what we do is we have our urinary and excretory system, which allow us to remove those nitrogenous wastes, allow us to remove the unused energy, the unable to be broken down parts of food, so that they don't just stay within the system and clog it up, and instead are able to be removed so that we can fill it with more and continue the process. We then have reproduction. Anything that is technically alive needs to be able to make new copies of itself. This is why viruses aren't classified as alive, because technically they need something else to reproduce them. They can't reproduce themselves. And so when we talk about reproduction, right, human reproduction, it is the biological male reproductive system, the biological female reproductive system, and those two systems work together to allow for meiosis to happen, to allow for half of one person to join with half of another person to make a whole new organism that is 50% of both the parents. All things don't do this the same way. Some things work via binary fission, which is basically a cloning process of yourself. Some things actually don't work on like a 50-50. There are bees specifically that actually can impregnate themselves, right? Female bees have the ability to create new bees, but this is kind of a side tangent. But female bees, if they reproduce with just themselves, only make male bees. But if a female bee reproduces with a male bee, I know this sounds really weird, it will create a female bee. So any male bee is a clone of the female, was made because the female cloned itself into a male. While all females were made from a female mating with a male. And oftentimes, we hate this idea, the female bees clone themselves to make male bees and then reproduce with those male bees to make more female bees. It's a weird idea, but all things need to reproduce. It doesn't always work the same way. It's not always, egg and sperm, but for humans, it's the egg and sperm coming together half and half. Then we have growth. Things need to be able to grow. Things need to be able to increase in size. There's actually a couple ways to grow. You can increase in the size of the cells or the number of cells. When we are infants, we are primarily, and really infants / fetus, we are primarily increasing in the number of cells, right? Just mass replicating cells over again. And then as we get older, it becomes increasing size of cells and specialization of the cells. What actually goes into the cell? What is it made out of? So growth is a vital portion of anything's survival. And so those are our major requirements / criteria for life. Anytime we go to Mars and take samples, anytime we see something that we think maybe, we look at those criteria and we say, only if it hits every single criteria of life can we really consider it to be a living thing. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up this criteria of life idea, right? When we are in homeostasis, it's primarily the brain sending electrical signals and the endocrine system dropping hormones that kind of regulates our ability to respond and to maintain homeostasis. Those are our two kind of major systems that are regulating and controlling homeostasis. And so on those questions at the bottom of page 2, right, those two systems responsible for communication are going to be the nervous and the endocrine. So I just want to make sure we are good on that piece. All right, so now we are going to kind of get into the last bit of this idea on homeostasis with generally how is homeostasis being regulated, controlled, and how do we really look at these loops that lead to the controlling of homeostasis? And so let's start with this idea that homeostasis is constantly being messed with. Your life messes with homeostasis, right? Your body is 98.6, you go outside, someone coughs on you, all of a sudden you've got a virus, and now we've got to respond to that, right? Your immune system has ways to respond to that. And so external stimuli are really what disrupt our homeostasis, and our internal stimuli are what is going to be responsible for righting that injustice, for fixing the problems that happen within the system. And it is almost always a result of a outside factor or an environmental factor impacting you. Right, like I said, nervous system, endocrine system are the major systems that are regulating and keeping these things in control to some extent. And the way that these systems control and maintain homeostasis, we call a feedback loop. Basically, something happens in your environment, there's a change, something occurs, and what happens as a result of that change, and how do we get back to our baseline? How do we get back to homeostasis after that change has happened in the environment? So we are going to start by talking about negative feedback loops. And negative feedback loops are a little bit confusing in that people hear the word negative and they think bad, right? Negative, oh, it means it's always going down. But that's not really what this means. A negative feedback loop is a feedback loop in which the stimulus, the thing that changes in the environment, is being reduced, right? So initial stimuli, the first thing that happens is getting brought down, being reduced back to normal. And so let me give an example. Let me try and kind of explain this idea. Let's talk about body temperature. If I go out in, let's say I'm in like a 70-degree room right now, I walk outside and it's 110 degrees. That is a change in the environment, right? My environment has changed. I've put myself in a new place, and that is our stimulus. The first thing, the change. So now I have walked outside and I am in the heat. Well, how do I feel that? How does my body actually know that we've changed temperatures? Well, I have receptors, right? I have temperature receptors that are within my body. For all of our stimuli, for all the things that happen in our environment, we have receptors. Let's say you are walking and all of a sudden you have to stop because a drawbridge goes up. Well, how do you know it went up? Well, I have eyeballs, and the eyes see it. Once I see it, it sends signals to my brain. And so receptors are what tell us something has changed in the environment, right? They make us privy to the stimulus. Then we have the control center, right? My eyeballs can see that there's a change. My body can feel that it's hot, but my eyes can't make something happen. My eyes can't regulate that. And so receptors always have to send that information to somewhere where it can deal with that, where it can integrate and control the response. And that is what is called our control center, right? It's going to determine what the next action is going to be, what the ideal next action is. For, seeing the drawbridge go up, all right, what's the ideal next action? Stop. Wait. Amazing. Then we have our next one, which is our effector. So control center, usually the brain, is going to determine an action. The effector is the thing or the organ that is able to make that response happen. If I said, okay, the drawbridge is going up, you need to stop walking. Well, how do you do that? Well, muscles in your leg have to stop stimulating, have to stop twitching, have to stop contracting. That's easy, right? And the effector there is the muscles. The control center sends the message, sends the signal, says stop moving, to the effector, and the effector can put that into place. If we're talking about the temperature situation, right, your brain says, it is too hot, I am overheating, and your body says, great, let's start opening up some of those receptors. Let's start moving body heat out across our whole body so that it can diffuse into the environment and so we can get rid of some of that heat. It is a way for us to regulate that change, right? And as a response, what is going to happen is that initial stimulus, that change in the environment, it being hot, my body temperature rising, is now going to drop back down because now I'm sweating, and that causes my temperature to lower, right? I was going to walk over the bridge and fall to my death, but instead I stop because I was able to stop the muscles from continuing to move. And the response is the outcome. In a negative feedback loop, that response will always be a reduction of the initial change, the initial stimuli. Okay? And so let's look at a couple of examples of this. In general, we have two pathways when we're talking about feedback loops, because you have the pathway from receptor to the control center, right? This is called the afferent pathway. And that is basically, how do we get information to the control center, to the brain, to the spinal cord. And then we have the second pathway, the second half of this, which is our efferent pathway. And that pathway is really just about, once the control center has made a decision, how does it then get information to the effector organ? Think efferent effect, right? The efferent pathway is going to put the effect into play and create a response. And so let's do a quick kind of example of one of these. Let's do a hot plate. And so I want you to imagine, right, you are walking past something, you put your hand on the table, and the table is burning hot. Stimulus, pain. In your hand, you have pain receptors. And they immediately feel that pain, right? They immediately trigger, and they know something's happening. That signal will then get sent. And so for our receptor here, it's going to be those pain receptors, right, in the hands. Those pain receptors will then send that signal from my hand down the pathway to my spinal cord. For something like pain, we actually don't need to send it all the way to your brain. Time is the most important thing here. And so a delayed response is a bad response. So we actually, for things like pain, for things like a withdrawal reflex, which is what we call this, we actually don't even have to send this to the brain. It just goes to the spinal cord. Your spinal cord has enough information to go like, bad, move. And so you pull away. But receptor, right? The hands, the receptors in the hand, send it to the spinal cord. That is our control center. The spinal cord says we need to pull that tissue away from the hot surface. The longer it's on the surface, the more layers of skin get damaged, the worse it'll be. And so your brain then sends signals to your muscles, to your bicep, right? Your bicep is then going to contract, right? It is going to create a muscle contraction that will then shorten your arm, pulling your hand off the hot surface. That is the response. My hand is removed from the hot surface. I am no longer in that level of pain because I've gone through this negative feedback loop. And this is what we call that withdrawal reflex, right? You touch it, your body senses it with the receptors, sends it to the spinal cord says move, you then send that signal back to the muscle, and then that will cause the withdrawal. Now, what I want you guys to do is try to answer this one with your team, with your table, about potential heat in a home, and see if you could think about what would be the stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, and response in this scenario. Take a second, right? Pause the video, answer that one, and then we'll get going for the last bit of this. So our last example of negative feedback loops are going to be hunger and satiety, right? Basically, are you hungry or are you satiated? And in our body, right, when our body fat increases, what happens is we start releasing this thing called leptin, right? It's happening within the fat cells. When that leptin gets released, our hypothalamus, so just a part within our brain, within the midbrain, is actually going to get that hormone. When that hormone reaches the hypothalamus, it is going to decrease your appetite. Makes sense, right? Fat is getting high. We don't want excessive fat because excessive anything, like we talked about with water, isn't ideal. And so as that fat becomes higher, our body then says we need to eat less and decreases our appetite. As that appetite decreases, our ability to expend energy then also increases. Why? Well, we just took in all this food. We just took in all this energy. Now let's use it. This is metabolism. It's about breaking and then making. If you don't do the and then making piece, things go wrong. And so this whole feedback loop is about bringing nutrients in. Once those nutrients are there, reducing our want to bring nutrients in and increasing our want to use those nutrients. It maintains and regulates this feedback loop, and it keeps our level of glucose, our level of food in our body at a consistent level, or for this one specifically, fat. But it's just a way to regulate fat levels so that if we get too high, we drop back down. And on the inverse, if we all of a sudden stop eating fat, our body is going to do the inverse reaction. It is going to decrease our energy usage, right? We don't have enough energy, so don't use it. And this is what's really going to allow us to regulate our hunger and our appetite here, right? And so this is that inverse, right? When we don't have enough body fat, right, our body will all of a sudden decrease its fat expenditure, and our appetite will also start to increase. This is where I'm going to tell my last little story for today before we finish here, which is my college diet. So when I went to college, and some of you guys have heard this before, again in bio, when I went to college, I was a little bit overweight. I went in and I had a little bit of a health scare in my winter of my freshman year. And so coming out of that, I thought I am going to try and start a diet. And in my brain, I didn't really research it. I didn't really look into it. And what I thought a diet was just pure calorie restriction. And so what I would do is I would go to the gym and I would run on the treadmill. And whatever I burned on the treadmill, I would then allow myself to eat for that day. And at first, it was successful. It worked great. I was like, man, I'm losing weight like that. And then about a month into that, the weight loss kind of stopped. And I started feeling really bad all the time. I would sleep about 12 to 14 hours a day. This is during college, so not ideal. And I was always hungry while also always tired. It was like this constant, hangry kind of feeling. And as I kind of continued and learned more, what I really learned is that my way of dieting actively prevented me from doing my goal. If the goal was losing fat, well, entirely restricting food meant that I was playing with this feedback loop that wanted to be in homeostasis. And I made it so far out of homeostasis that it was giving all of the feedback, right, which I needed, which my body was saying, hey, you are hungry. Why was I sleeping so much? I didn't have enough energy. And so it shut down systems that were about burning energy. It shut down systems that were designed to make muscle. Because why make muscle if you don't have the energy for it? And so negative feedback loops are really about maintaining and keeping us at levels. Whether it's hunger, whether it is water, whether it is blood temperature, blood pressure, all of these things we try and keep at a perfect level. And diseases, problems within our body oftentimes come because we are doing something to these feedback loops that keep them out of regulation. And so those are our negative feedback loops, right? This is that idea of opposing mechanisms. Finally, as we age, right, as we get older, we have disruptions to homeostasis. That is aging. Aging is the idea that the longer you live, the more things break. We know this, it's true of anything, right? What car is going to work better? One made today or one made 40 years ago that's been driven for 40 years? The one made today, obviously, right? And so as we age, things start to break down. You start to get less efficient. Things start to be harder to regulate. And as those things become harder and harder to regulate, we start to see more disruptions to homeostasis. We start to see things break down easier. We start to see things like blood sugar, right? Diabetes becomes much, much, much more significant the older we get. Things like heart failure become much, much, much more significant the older we get, because if your heart's been pumping for 40 years and you've been making it work hard, well, at 41, it's not going to be able to do what it was able to do nearly as well as it was when it was 14, 15, 16. And this is also why it's so important for you guys to maintain these systems, because caring for it now means that the older and older and older you get, the less wear and tear will be on these systems, and the less you have to worry about failing or breaking down. And so that is our negative feedback loop, right? This system of maintaining the status quo, of keeping ourselves regulated. But we actually have two kinds of feedback loops. There is the negative feedback loop about reducing a stimulus, bringing us back down to baseline. But then we have a positive feedback loop. And this is actually the inverse. Rather than taking that first stimulus and reducing it, bringing us back to zero, this is about taking that stimulus and amplifying it, right? This is the domino effect. Positive feedback loops, in the same way, negative, you don't want to think, oh, negative is bad. Positive is not a good thing. It's not good. It's not positive because of that. It's positive because the first thing builds on the second, builds on the third, builds on the fourth, builds on the fifth, over and over and over again until something happens. And I'll give you an example of this. during childbirth, the way that this works is that at the end of the uterus, right near the base of the cervix, is going to be stretch receptors. And these stretch receptors have the ability of releasing oxytocin, right? Which is just a hormone. Specifically, it is a anti-stress and kind of happiness hormone. Now, as that oxytocin gets released, what starts to happen is the uterus starts to stretch. That will then stimulate a release of oxytocin. Oxytocin allows us to push past the barrier in our brain that says, don't push, right? And so oxytocin releases and we push. As we push, the stretching increases, which means more oxytocin gets released, which means we push more. And then we push more, which means more stretch receptors get triggered, which means more oxytocin gets released, which means more pushing. This happens over and over and over again until eventually the baby pops out. The baby has fully stretched the receptors. All the oxytocin needed has been released. The baby's out. And then because the stretch receptors aren't being pressed on anymore, oxytocin stops being released. That is what ends the cycle, right? Positive feedback is about building until a reaction happens and then falling back to the baseline, back to where you were, until that reaction response has to happen again. And so big thing here for positive versus negative feedback loops, I want you to think negative is about reducing initial stimulus to bring us back to level. Positive is about amplifying that initial stimulus to bring us to a large response. All right, that is it for today. That is it for our notes. Into our next class, I want you guys to make sure, if you didn't finish the notes for today, that you're able to get those done, fully submitted. I will be stamping those at the start of next class. If you would like, please start working on that LS1 Explore. Remember, you guys do not have a lot of time in class for those. Only time that is not being used for, other activities, so only free time. Things like you finish the eye in 30 minutes, so you have an extra 30. And so make sure that if you don't tend to have a lot of extra time in class, that you're still working on those explores, still getting that credit so that you are in the best position at the end of the unit to do well on the test, to do well on the unit plan, and feel good about where you're at in the class. Thank you again for watching through this video lecture. I hope this was helpful. I hope I didn't run through it too fast. Any questions you guys have, please send me an email, drop them in the Google Classroom, or put them on this video in general. I can answer anyone's, and if you have the question, I'm sure 10 other people did as well. The more you guys ask, the easier it is for me to put those out, and the better it is for years after. They'll already have those things answered. So have an amazing rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next video.